you again for coming. My name is Sarah Boleen. I'm the events coordinator here. And really, on behalf of the entire staff, we're so pleased to welcome you to Politics and Prose. And I'm especially pleased tonight to welcome Maggie Shipstead back to P&P for her new novel. Which is called Astonish Me. Maggie was last here for her debut, Seating Arrangements, which was the winner of the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction. Her writing has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Tin House, and the Best American Short Stories. Astonish Me tells a story of Joan, American ballet dancer, who, after helping a Soviet ballet star defect to the U.S., leaves the stage to start a family. And then when her own son, shows his own prodigious talents for dance, her past and her present collide. Tonight, Maggie will be in conversation with another wonderful novelist who I hope many of you already know is Jennifer Close. She's the author of Girls in White Dresses, and her second novel, The Smart One, is now out in paperback. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Maggie and Jen back to Politics and Prose.
Yeah, I think so.
Get somewhere else. You're so tall.
Hi, everyone. I have... Oh, okay. Great. Thank you. I have a bunch of questions to ask Maggie, but I think she's going to read just a little bit of the book first, which is great for those of you who haven't read it, so you can hear just a little bit of it, and I think she'll start.
Yeah, I'm just going to read a couple pages sort of from the middle of the book. This is about a character who's not the main character. This is Elaine, who's a principal dancer in an unnamed ballet company that's in New York City. And she's on tour with the company in Southern California, and this is set in October 1985. Elaine begins her day with a very hot shower, instant coffee, a brisk walk from the hotel to the theater, and company class on the stage. Rehearsals will be later, after the sets are loaded in. Since she is one of the first to arrive, she helps drag the bars out from the wings. The airplane has left her tight. She can gauge her muscles' moods perfectly. Today, they pull at her bones like recalcitrant children. So she leaves her sweatshirt on over her leotard and adds a pair of vinyl shorts, rolling the waist down around her hips. By the time the last dancers arrive and Mr. K claps his hands to begin class, her muscles have begun to relent, and she has a sweat going. She is 31 now, her body already less tolerant and cooperative than it was. The days when she could party through the night and survive class are long gone. She doesn't smoke, drinks less, eats well, has cut out drugs, except for coke, just a tiny bit before performances and at intermission. Sometimes a bump in the afternoon if she's having a long day. She travels, she meets people, has lovers, but loves only Mr. K. She is applauded. But all of that happens around the periphery of the narrow range of activities, class, yoga, massage, sleep, that will help her remain a dancer. She scrabbles against her inevitable decline, works to retain her strength, stave off injury. She has had stress fractures, torn ligaments, surgery on her left knee. Never in her life, not once, has she danced the way she wishes to, but futility has become an accepted companion. The ideal that lives beyond the mirror makes teasing, flickering appearances, but never quite shows itself, never solidifies into something that can be looked at and not just glimpsed. She might surprise it as she whips her head around, spotting during pirouettes, or catch it flitting through one hand or foot, but it never stays. I'll stop there.
Good, thank you. It's so good, it's so pretty. I told Maggie when I was getting ready to write some questions today, I started reading it, and 20 pages later I was like, I have to concentrate a little bit more. So this book takes place, a lot of it is about ballerinas. It's about a lot more. But my first question for you is how you chose the subject, how you came to it. I am strangely fascinated by ballet. I have danced when I was 5, and then I think they said bye. I was in the Nutcracker. But it's not that. It's more that it's any movie about ballerinas or that weird reality show draws me in because it's so physical and there's such a short time and it's so competitive and it's something that's so pretty and there's so many unpretty parts. So I guess I'm wondering how you sort of came to this topic. Is it something that you've always loved or just fascinated like me?
I mean, it sounds like we have almost the same experience where I danced when I was 5 and then it was just clear I had absolutely no aptitude for it. And they're like, you're a little large and you're a little not talented. And my mom is a really serious ballet fan, like much more serious than I am. And like the kind of person who would wait, in the pre-dawn hours to get standing room tickets to something. And I think she sort of experimented with seeing if I would be a dancer, but what she really wanted was someone who would go to the ballet with her. So she started taking me to the ballet when I was 5. And so we went probably 4 times a year until I was 18 and left for college. And I grew up in Southern California, and there was a really great performing arts center there. So we saw amazing companies. American Ballet Theater came every year. We saw European companies. She and I went to St. Petersburg when I was 15, and we saw the Mariinsky Ballet there. So it always had kind of been a part of my life. And I think like lots of people who write short stories, I'm always sort of trying to come up with new topics. And so this book started as a short story I wrote when I was at Stanford on a fellowship and had to generate a lot of stories. And it didn't really work. My first book also started as a failed short story. And it was about Joan, who's the main character of Astonish-me, and it covered about 20 years. But wasn't very much about dancing. And then I had written 100 pages of what I thought would be my second novel. And then I took a break from that to sort of revise the story. And as I revised, it kind of spiraled out of control and became 90 pages, which we can all agree is a little bit long for a short story. And I sent it to my agent being like, maybe this is a novella. And she saw more places for expansion. And so I expanded. We probably did 2 more drafts. And then after my publisher bought it, we continued expanding. So every draft, this book has gotten longer, which I think is a pretty unusual trajectory. But yeah, I mean, I think like what you said, for a writer, this is just sort of the opposite of your life. Like it's an artistic practice, but it's physical, it's collaborative, it's not sitting alone in a room, being stationary. And so I think dancers' lives are so interesting and so far away from mine. And I'm also just interested in how people encounter their own limitations and how they experience talent. And for dancers, so much of that is tied up in the body. It just really intrigued me.
Good, thank you. So now I'm going to ask you about the research that you did, because even the details of the character that was Elaine that you just read, the details of what they eat and what their body feels like, and even the drugs that she's doing, which everyone laughed at. But I was just curious, where did you talk to people? Did you shadow them? Did you just do research online or read biographies? All of that.
Yeah, I really didn't talk to any professional dancers. I've talked to some now, which is perhaps a little bit late since it's a published book.
Because now I think they all do cocaine.
Well, and I think it's changed since the 70s. And most of this book is about dancers in the 70s. And I think there's a lot. Dancers have slightly longer careers now, partly because we know more about dance medicine and how to maintain the body. But yeah, in the 70s, I think it was a little bit the Wild West. Wait, what's the first part of your question?
Just the research that you did.
Oh, yeah. So I was traveling while I wrote this book. I wrote this book in 5 months, which is pretty quick. And the thing that's most portable is the internet. And I did lug a big hardback reference book with me, but mostly I used YouTube. And it's an amazing dance resource because any variation I was writing about, I could watch multiple versions. I could watch different eras, different dancers, different companies. Some ballet companies put a lot online, specifically New York City Ballet and the Royal Ballet. They put rehearsal videos up. The Royal Ballet has a video of an entire company class. It's an hour and 15 minutes long, which is incredibly helpful to me. There's a weird video, I think it's City Ballet, of a pas de deux, and the ballerina is wearing a GoPro camera on her head, and so you see the theater sort of swirling around. So all of that was helpful, and ballet documentaries, just the way dancers talked about their lives, I relied pretty heavily on that. And I read, but but not really a huge amount. I think it was kind of research of a visual nature for the most part, but it was also just a calculated kind of gamble as far as getting it right.
I think you did it perfectly. Was there anything surprising or fascinating that you learned about the ballet in your research, or that?
Yeah, one thing that sticks out, and I think it's kind of actually a boring detail, but was really interesting to me, was the way that in a class or in a rehearsal, the person that's in charge, the way they communicate with the dancers. For being a verbal person and someone who's always kind of trying to articulate things well, their instructions to me seem really inarticulate, but I think they incorporate a lot of gestures. So a dancer would do something, and then the choreographer, the ballet master, whatever, would sort of say, yes, but more like this, and would make a gesture and say 3 words in French and sort of look at them, and they would understand. And it was just this form of communication that I think is so foreign to most people. And of course, years of study enables you to understand what they mean. But that was something that really struck me, just sort of the language of dance.
Oh, that's really interesting. I was just saying backstage, I don't know how many of you have read this book or Seating Arrangements, which I loved as well, but it's different for a lot of reasons. But one thing that I didn't realize until the end was this spans, I don't even know how many years, 40 years?
30, I think. Yeah.
30. And Seating Arrangements is one weekend. Was that a conscious choice? Was it something that you kind of wanted to do because you had done the opposite, or was it just happen naturally?
I think the structure in general and the scale of it arose fairly organically. The original short story covered 20 years in 30 pages, which is perhaps a clue as to why the story didn't really work. And when I started expanding it, if you've read it, the chronology jumps around quite a bit. And the original version was actually significantly choppier, to the point that I think it was really confusing for readers. But I started in the early 70s and wrote forward, and then as I would write a section, say, in the mid-80s, and then I would come to a place where there was a piece of information that's missing. And then instead of writing a flashback, I would just jump to that year and write a short section in that year. And so it sort of evolved just as I went. I wrote straight through, but with the jumping around, I don't really outline. So I suppose I knew from the beginning that that's how it would work, but I didn't have a fixed scope. I didn't know how late it would go. And I think with both my books, I've been slightly surprised when I arrived at the end.
Which is always good.
Yeah.
Makes you keep
Go.
writing. Yeah.
I'm done.
That's nice. Can you just talk a little bit about the character of Mr. K? He was actually, I was fascinated by a lot of the characters. I loved Joan, and I think you said she was the first character that she was in the short story. And I loved Elaine. I loved all of them, but Mr. K was fascinating to me. Was he based on anyone real, or was he...
Well,
I'm just going to trail off my question while I wait.
Mr. K is the artistic director of this dance company that the book centers around. He's in some ways, modeled off George Balanchine, who's known as Mr. B. But Mr. K is bisexual and has sort of affairs with men that happen outside anyone's sort of sphere of knowledge. Like, everyone in the company knows that he goes off into New York and has these encounters, but he also sleeps with female dancers whom he sort of sees as vessels for his art, and he has a long-term relationship with Elaine. And he's it's almost a rite of passage for these dancers who are getting promoted, which is not actually the way Balanchine operated, unless that's just been missed by history, but I don't think so. Balanchine married like 4 or 5 times. So I was interested in him as someone whose life is almost purely aesthetic. He loves these women because of how they're able to sort of express his vision. And Elaine is, he says to her at one point that she's his idea of a woman, but she's not his ideal of a woman. And she knows that would just be, that's sort of an unachievable status. And he has this notion of women that no one will ever quite live up to.
Probably not something you want to hear someone say. There was a lot of sad love stories in the book, in the background. What was the difference that you had writing and publishing this and your first book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although I don't really have a very interesting answer, partly because I cracked the system and sold my second novel before my first novel was published. My publisher, Knopf, bought Astonish Me 2 weeks before Seating Arrangements came out. So I wrote it completely without any knowledge of what it was like to publish a book.
So it was done when they bought it?
Pretty much. I mean, of course, almost 2 years went by between the sale and the publication. Same with Seating Arrangements. So we did keep working on it, but it was a complete book. So I was writing it without, any criticisms to respond to, without any praise to live up to, without any notion of how well my first book would sell or anything like that. And it was a really pleasurable, bordering on joyful writing experience because it was just for me. Like, I was really writing this book as a reader in a way. Like, I wrote what I wanted to have happen, and the book's tone is meant to mimic the tone of a ballet. It has sort of a melodrama to it, and it has it's kind of episodic in the way that ballets are. So it was really a pretty nice experience. But then with the actual publication, I mean, I think I had a better sense of, I was really anxious before Seating Arrangements came out the last month, and I was really anxious again with this one. So I guess that's just, no.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing style and habits and sort of what you do to, you said you don't outline, but to sort of, do you have a schedule or do you just sort of go months without writing and then write? What do you do?
Yeah, I do go months without writing.
I find this question really interesting. So go ahead.
My first book I lived on Nantucket alone in the off season for 8 months, which is a really good way to lose your mind. If you're so inclined, I recommend it. I didn't quite know what I was getting into, and Seating Arrangements was set on a fictionalized Nantucket. And I'd finished grad school and I had a little bit of fellowship money. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to go. I'm sure I'll meet people. I managed to meet no one in 8 months. And I would just walk my dog, and it was gray and it was windy. But that turned out to be a really good way to get work done. And it also sort of hardened me in a way to solitude. And so now if you said you won't have a social interaction for the next month, I'd be like, okay, fine. It's no big deal. So when I'm actually working, I probably work 7 days a week. And probably a minimum of 3 or 4 hours, and sometimes up to 8, I would say. Seating Arrangements, I hand wrote quite a bit of. I still handwrite when I get stuck, but I type mostly just because it's more efficient. And Astonish Me, I wrote the 5 months that I was writing it, I was also traveling alone. And you guys are going to feel really sorry for me because I spent a month in Bali. I spent 3 months in Paris, and I spent a month in Edinburgh, and then I was done. It was great. So, for me, a big struggle is sort of trying to find a balance between having a functional, normal life and creating that sort of solitude and space to work.
Good. That makes me feel less crazy. It's really easy to write when no one's around. Is there anything that you're working on now that you can talk about? You can feel free to say no.
No, I've been talking about my third novel, so I'm just locking myself into it like day by day. I've written probably 100 pages of a third novel, and it starts in 1914 and progresses through World War II, and then this female pilot after World War II tries to fly around the Earth north-south, like over the poles, which nobody did until the 60s, possibly because it would have been impossible in the year that I'm setting this. So it's sort of this logistical nightmare and a historical research nightmare. And then there's also a contemporary story about an actress playing that pilot in a biopic. But for someone who likes to travel, it's a good way to apply for stuff. I'm going to the high Arctic for the second half of June on this weird trip for artists that's like a tall ship, and they at 80 degrees north in this Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, and they load up the ship with artists, and then they'll sort of anchor somewhere and guards go to shore to look for polar bears. And if there are no polar bears, they're like, okay, bring over the artists. And everyone goes to shore and does their art project. And so I'm doing that. I've been to some of the other places on this line of longitude that I've chosen. And I applied for the National Science Foundation's Antarctica Artists and Writers program. So, it's all just a big scam.
We will have to talk more about the boat later. That is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. That's fantastic. Was there any character that you felt, especially, like I said, there was a couple storylines that kind of broke my heart. Chloe kind of broke my heart. Was there any character that sort of you felt like they were your favorite, or that you sort of knew something had to happen to them and you didn't want it to?
No, I'm such a chicken about putting my characters through bad things. I feel like I sort of don't do it to the degree. Like, this happened with seating arrangements. Like, a lot of people were like, I thought Win was going to die at the end. It never occurred to me to kill this character. Yeah, just spoiler alert. Nobody dies in seating arrangements. I'm really not an autobiographical writer. There's no character in either of my books that lines up with me in any sort of meaningful way. But in Astonish-moi, I mean, in a way I was most interested in writing about Arslan, who's the Soviet defector. He's sort of a ballet superstar. But it was sort of in this external way where I was interested just in writing about taking charisma seriously, I guess, as a force in the world, and for a dancer, just being this sort of invaluable, inherent thing that he has. And the other storylines, there's a lot in Southern California where I grew up, and so that was sort of satisfying to write about. But no, I kind of enjoyed all of them. I liked writing about Elaine. I thought she was interesting. She's more talented than Joan. She's a principal dancer. But I think the book sort of arose out of a curiosity about, what do you do when your dream sort of fails you and the process is no longer enough to sustain you, which is what happens to Joan. And so it really arose out of that, this character who's lived a very disciplined life but just can't quite make it happen.
That's a good answer. I have to say, sometimes when there's books with multiple perspectives and you like them all, but you get to one, you're kind of like, oh, okay. I have to say that didn't happen to me, but that didn't happen to me in this book. I really loved them all, and they all had something new. I'll ask one more question, and then I'll maybe give the audience a chance. What are you reading, or what have you read in the past year that you loved?
So I'm reading a lot to research this weird polar pilot book. I recommend a book called The Ice Balloon, about someone trying to take a balloon to the North Pole, and sort of, as you'd expect, it doesn't really work out. Novels, my favorite novel I've read recently is Americana by Chimamanda Adichie. It's amazing. It's a really beautiful book, and it's sort of difficult to describe without making it sound heavy. And it is serious. Its themes are serious. It's about race and immigrants and blogging, but it's also just it's hair. Yeah, hair and love. I think she said one time it was about hair and love, and then she's never lived it down. But it's also just this compelling love story, and you'll just turn the pages. So I highly recommend that.
Does anyone have any questions?
And if you do, please go to the microphone.
Hi. Okay, so one of the things I really love about Astonish-moi is, aside from the defector aspect and I presume Arslan is inspired by Baryshnikov. He's an amazing character. But the thing I really loved about this book is that the way it's about talent, and the way in relationships, probably particularly with artists, you can sort of project onto someone talent and then be sort of disappointed that they're not talented enough. And I don't want to give too much away, but I just wanted to sort of ask you a little bit about that, because I find it really moving. And I think anyone who's ever been in the arts and sort of feels like, I don't know, if you sort of fall for someone who's more talented than you are, it's like your ultimate nightmare to discover that in fact your lack of talent is why they become disappointed in you. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's like really, really, really well done. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that as a theme in the book.
Sure. Eliot is a novelist, so I mean, I think in my day-to-day work life, I bump up against my limitations all the time. And I think it was Zadie Smith wrote something that was sort of like pieces of advice to writers, and she said something along the lines of, make peace with the fact that you're going to feel a little bit sad every single day because you're never going to do what you want to do. And your finished product is never going to be what you imagined. And I've read other writers say similar things, like Anne Patchett's essay collection. She talks about before she starts writing, she has this novel living in her head, and it's like this beautiful butterfly that's flapping around and flapping around, flapping around. And then she has to kill it because her book will never be, it's the pinned version of the butterfly, and it loses all its life that it has in your imagination. So I think writing about dance is in a way writing about writing. And talent, I've said this before, but I think in our culture we have sort of these two conflicting ideas about talent, which is that we think geniuses fall from the sky fully formed and don't have to work. And I think we also think that anyone can do anything if they work hard enough. And neither is true. And they're directly contradictory, yet lots of people seem to hold them both in their brain side by side, which is, something we're all capable of doing. And with ballet, I think it's particularly complicated issue, talent, because there are genetics involved. I think I read Baryshnikov, who is the model for this character Arslan Rusakov, although Rusakov is supposed to be sort of the idea of Baryshnikov as opposed to sort of the actual person. But Baryshnikov said something like his Achilles tendons are particularly tight, and this allows him to have a high vertical jump without doing a deep plie, which is an enormous advantage for a ballet dancer. And it's something that you have no control over, and it's just purely the way you're built. I think there's so much of that with dancers, and like in European ballet schools, they take x-rays of these tiny children's legs to see if they'll be able to get turnout. And there's something sort of merciful about being like, you're not, you're 4 years old, you're not going to make it. Like, don't do this but at the same time, I think this character Chloe in Astonish-moi is an example of how there is room for different kinds of dancers. But so much of our lives, I think, are out of our control, and talent, to a degree, is one of those things.
Hi. The first time I heard of your book was reading about it in Oprah magazine. And when I read the article, which was about you and your mother and your inspiration, I was very touched by the way that came out. So I'm asking, how does your mother feel about the book?
Yeah, in this month's O Magazine, and it's also online now, there's an essay I wrote about going to the ballet with my mother. She loves the book, thankfully. She was one of my first readers. I don't have a big circle of readers. Really, my agent, my editor read my stuff and no one else. But I sent her this when I'd finished the first draft, the sort of 90-page version. And she liked my first book very much, as far as I can tell. She's supportive. But this one, she said that she sort of couldn't even make dinner, and she sat at the counter and just read straight through it, which really meant a lot to me. And I think ballet is one of those things that was just always what we did together. But, when you're 7 years old, you don't think that much about it. But now that I'm an adult, it's just become more important. And every time I go to the ballet without her, I miss her.
Do I have to go over there?
Would the lady like to go first?
Sure. Please, I want to in a hurry.
What interests me about your book, I had just finished a piece of nonfiction by a local writer here who went out and followed a ball player in the minor leagues who made it to the AAA. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's just a level below the bigs. And I just wondered, did you, because it's the same thing that what you're talking about. Exactly. I know from experience from coaching that there are guys 5'10", 150 pounds. They can throw the ball harder than a guy 6'5", 230, and it's all, for lack of a better word, talent. You don't know why. Maybe they can X-ray them and find out. But that's what interested me in your book. I don't know anything about ballet, but I really saw a similarity between a young man or a young woman trying to make it into the professional athletes or even Division I athlete. And there's a point where you level off, or where the fun falls through and the rent comes due, and they send you packing. And I assume that's what happens to your heroine.
Yeah, she eventually stops dancing. She gets pregnant and chooses to quit dancing. But what you're saying, no, it's in the first chapter. Don't worry.
Guys can't do that.
Right. Yeah, they're safe. I mean, there are a lot of parallels between ballet dancers and athletes. And I think ballet dancers are really split on whether they want to be called athletes or not. But inevitably they are. And I think the ballet dancers who are successful, just like athletes who are successful, are the ones who can not only tolerate just the daily drills, but who thrive on that and the repetition. Because dancers take class every morning. They do the same movements thousands, probably millions of times over the years. And I think that is sort of an essential component to it. I had dinner with two dancers who were former New York City Ballet principals. And one thing they said that surprised me is I asked them what they missed, having now been retired. And the woman was a full-on Balanchine ballerina, Heather Watts, and her husband also is a principal. And they both said that they missed taking class every morning. And I think I would have expected, missing performance or missing the thrill. And they said no, class was the way that they sort of set their lives in order.
Well, I don't have a question, but I was a ballet dancer in the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo in a completely different era, but the ballet has a lot of things that never change. And I loved your book. It could have been my life in many ways, not exactly, but I married a dancer who was a better dancer than I was, and all the complications that go with things like that. And I couldn't put the book down. I read it in 2 days, and it moved me so much, and it made me sad and happy both, because it put me right back in 50, 60 years ago, because now I'm very old, and I'm 83, so I was in the Ballet Russe in the early 50s. It is old when you've been a dancer. But it was wonderful, and I really came to thank you. I don't have any questions.
Thank you. I'm honestly incredibly honored to hear that. Thank you.
The book is wonderful.
Can't top that. Just a question for both of you. If you want to become a neurosurgeon, it's absolutely clear what you have to do. If you want to be a great ballet dancer, I think in the book it's clear how you make a career. But if you're a writer or an artist, it's not at all clear, I would think, what you're supposed to do to become one of those. How did you both decide to be writers, and when you decided that, how did you think about becoming a writer?
You start. I'm still recovering.
No, that almost made me cry, and that wasn't my book. I think I teared up. I know. It was the nicest comment I've ever seen at any book reading. It's a funny thing. I teach at GW now, too, and a lot of my students ask me that, and there is no clear path. The hardest thing is you just have to keep doing it. And I think some people think you get up every day and you're excited to write, and sometimes I am, but sometimes you're not. Most days you have to just make yourself sit down. This isn't what they want to hear either when I tell them this. But I think it's just you have to keep going, and you have to know that you can't really set goals. You can't say, if I sell a book in this time, if my book does this well, if I worked in magazines for years, and I have to say, sometimes I just wish I wanted a normal job, because there's a lot of things that are a lot more satisfactory when you're working, when there's something physical that you're putting out and it's not just you. I don't even know if that answers your question. So I love writing. I'm so happy I'm a writer, but
when did you start?
I've always written. I found this awful novel that I actually threw away. And then everyone was like, why'd you throw it? I'm like, if something happens to me and people find this. I wrote it in high school. It was awful. But I think there's books that I read that really helped me. Anne Lamott wrote a great book, Bird by Bird. Anne Patchett's, her essays are amazing on writing. I think I always thought writers sat and like wrote the first sentence and ended with the last sentence. And it took me a while to realize that's not what happens, and it's messy, and you write a lot that's not good. So I think hearing that helped me. I've always written. I think it took a while. It's kind of embarrassing to say you want to be a writer, because I think it's just like I don't know. I think people look at you like, okay. I mean, it's like saying like, I want to be a superstar. It's you have to put yourself out there. So I think, yeah, I've always wanted to do it. I think probably after college is when I said like, I'm really gonna try to do this. And I think everyone was like, good luck.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question enough, but.
No, I still get that. People be like, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a novelist. And they're sort of like,
Someone said, and my friend is here, she can say, someone goes, good for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I came to it a little later. I didn't write fiction at all until college. I took a fiction workshop just more or less purely on a whim. And that was my sophomore year. My junior year, Zadie Smith, who I already mentioned, just because she's amazing, she was teaching a workshop that you had to apply for, and so I applied, and then the day they posted the class list, I went and looked, I wasn't on it, and I was sort of like, oh, well, that was a fun experiment. And then later somebody was like, oh, congratulations, and I'd been looking at the wrong list. And I think if no one had told me I was on that list and I hadn't been in her workshop, I wouldn't have written any more fiction. And so it was kind of this strange, random, pivotal moment. I found her very inspiring because she was really tough. And she made it clear that our work was not good, but that it could be good. And it's a hard road to hoe. And so I sort of thought, okay, I'll just keep trying. And so I wrote a collection of short stories as my senior thesis, and I graduated and had no idea what to do with myself. I was kind of being like, I'm going to be a handbag designer. And people were like, well, you're verbal, you should be a lawyer. And I worked at a law firm. It really wasn't for me. And so I applied to the Iowa Writers Workshop, also sort of on a whim, sort of assuming I wouldn't get in and that I would reapply the next year. And then I got in, to my sort of astonishment, and went. And so there was 2 years of my life sort of planned out for me. And that's really when I became serious about it and when it started to seem like a viable possibility. But as Jennifer was saying, it's difficult to sort of make peace with the fact that you're never going to write a first draft that's publishable or that's really any good, and sort of adjusting to the sort of geological timetable of it, I think, is part of what separates the men from the boys. Is just understanding that everything takes forever. And reading a lot, I think, is the best thing you can do. Like, I was an English major in college, which I think is much better than being... Some schools have creative writing majors now, and to me, I don't think that's particularly helpful for especially very young people. So it was all sort of accidental. It's worked out.
Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Micah.
Full disclosure, we were in college together.
Micah's one of my roommates.
But in reading your stuff, a lot of different stuff that you've written, some of the magic sauce is that when you're reading, you're not really aware that you're reading. You're just sort of pouring through it. And I think in trying to figure out what makes that way, I've, when reading other things, you notice it when the sort of honesty of the way people react and their emotions gets, broken in other books. And you're suddenly like, oh, I don't know if I think a person would have said that or thought that way. And with your stuff, I feel like I've always been so drawn in because there's so much honesty about the way that people react to situations are really diverse, and different personalities have this internal logic about how they do things. And so I'm really curious. I know you do a lot of research about the sort of facts of it, but I have no idea how you know how all of these different people in all these different scenarios are going to say the right thing and do the right thing, so that in my mind I'm like, of course, this is like totally all like part of this internal logic. And I thought, maybe you have enough people read it with enough different experiences and they're like, oh yeah, that's right, but you don't. So how do you know, you know if you get your facts right, but how do you know if you get all that other stuff right?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'll buy you a drink later. And I mean, you don't. I think that's the big risk. For me, it's really a form of concentration, and I can tell when I'm writing and I'm not focusing and I'm just trying to sort of plow through. That's when it doesn't work or it rings false. And so sometimes I will, like, I'm not very mystical about the whole process. I don't sort of like that approach. I'm more workmanlike. But I will sometimes sort of step away from the computer and close my eyes and try and actually think of who this person is and what they would do in a situation. And that sort of kind of really mindful focus helps. But I mean, to a degree, I don't know. It's just, you just sort of do the best you can and hope for the best. And I always feel like I could look harder and that I could think harder. And those are sort of the two things I tell myself, like try to look harder, try to think harder. Because that's really what's essential. And John Gardner wrote a great writing book. I think it's called Writing Fiction for Young People or something like that. But it's not for young people because it's incredibly dense and like wonky. But he says that fiction should be a vivid, continuous dream. And if you get something wrong, it shocks your reader out of the dream and it ruins it. And so you try as much as possible to sort of minimize the mistakes. Either factual mistakes can do this or just emotional mistakes and that sort of thing. So that's sort of, what to aspire to.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks.
There was clapping when we were waiting back there, and I said, they're already clapping for you. Maggie goes, oh, it's my roommate from college, probably. Does anyone have another question? Oh, good.
Have you seen Center Stage?
Yes.
And do you love it?
Yes.
And so thank you. Okay, great.
I'm so glad you asked the question. I was too embarrassed to ask.
Yep.
Great.
No shame. I also love it. And I was wondering, if you haven't seen it, it's hokey, but it's great. And it's real dancing. Yeah. They're just body doubles.
Most of them are real dancers.
Some of them are real dancers. Yeah.
Which adds to the hokiness of the acting.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's called Center Stage.
Center Stage.
It's a movie.
Like 1990.
No,
2001?
it's 2000. I
Yeah.
just did a screening of Center Stage where I
Fantastic.
provided color commentary. Yeah.
Wonderful. So my question is, are there other works of art about ballet that you love and recommend?
Yeah, well, I highly recommend the entire Baryshnikov oeuvre of movies. And they have that same sort of issue where people who are phenomenal dancers aren't necessarily amazing cinematic actors. And then you throw in a couple real actors and they just make the dancers look like bad actors, but they also, then you have this sort of obvious body doubles. Probably the best is The Turning Point, which is very good, actually. There's a truly horrible movie called Dancers, which has amazing dancing, and it's sort of centered around a production of Giselle being put on in Italy. And Julie Kent, who's been a principal dancer at American Ballet Theatre for 20 years, is the female lead, and she's like 17 years old, opposite Baryshnikov. And she's also in Center Stage, actually. She's sort of the senior ballerina. And she's still a principal there. Then there's White Nights with Baryshnikov and Gregory Hines, in which Baryshnikov has defected and he's traveling with his ballet company and the plane crashes in the Soviet Union, and so he gets sucked back in. And Gregory Hines is like a reverse defector. He defected the Soviet Union. And they... Yes, Isabel Rossellini. And Helen Mirren plays the Soviet ballerina. So all of those are really worth a gander. Black Swan, sure, why not? And that's sort of... I mean, there aren't that many, but yeah. And other ballet novels, I have to say, I avoided reading. The Dancer by Colin McCann is about Nureyev. I haven't read it.
So I've read both your books, and I was totally amazed at how you were able, your first book was hysterical and a comedy, and the second book obviously, was not. And so I'm wondering what your plans for your third book are, because I would love to know when that would be released and published, because I'm ready to read again.
Oh, you and me both. I don't know. My books are very different, and it's funny because I had been a short story writer, obviously, through school, and all my stories are really different, take place in different places, different times, and so I sort of thought the universe knows that I write really different books or different things, and there's been a fair amount of surprise that Astonish-moi is so different than Seating Arrangements. I think also because plenty of people have made an entire career about sort of chronicling WASP manners, which is what Seating Arrangements was about. So my third book, I believe, will probably in tone be closer to Astonish-moi. I think it'll be not satirical, not funny. It might actually be less funny than Astonish-moi. And will be written in the past tense. Astonish-moi is present tense. Seating Arrangements is past tense. And there might be a first person element to it. So I mean, for me, just being able to do different things and learn about different worlds is a huge part of the appeal of my job. It's really, it's a nice way to live, and it's sort of rejuvenating. So I try to do different things, but then you have, sort of alienate different audiences of different books, and I don't know, whatever.
I do have one last question about how you write, since you say that you're alone all the time and we were talking about Twitter. How do you keep yourself from getting distracted?
Oh, the internet. It's so bad. I don't keep myself from getting distracted. I think part of the element of the solitude and the just open days is that it allows me just a lot of time to waste. Like, I can really exhaust my internet time and still have time to write. I think I'm sort of getting to the point where I'm going to need one of those programs that shuts down your internet. But on the other hand, writing things that are historical, even with Astonish-moi, that's how I would answer my questions. And I was always looking things up. So I can't really quite figure out how to make it work. But yeah, it's difficult.
I just really wanted to hear someone else say it was difficult. That's good. That's good. Do we have any other? Oh, one more question? Sure.
You can. I'll repeat it into the. Yeah.
Okay. I could leap over the chairs in a single bound. I was actually formulating a question about this essay I read by Rob Lowe today. Words didn't really make it fully into my brain, so I'm going to not say that, but I will admit that I read an essay by Rob Lowe today. Yeah, so sad. Oh my God. If you have a kid, you're like, yeah. My daughter turned 6 yesterday. I'm like, oh my God, only 13 more years. 14, whatever, 12, whatever. Anyway, this is not my question. My question is, I haven't read it yet because I just bought it, but it's about present tense because I teach at AU, so we probably know some of the same people, and this is one of my students, actually. So I'm interested in just sort of like how that complicates something as big as a novel, and what sort of like, what sort of like cliffs or what are the ways in which you had to kind of wrangle your way through like the limitations of present tense?
So I was writing in present tense from the beginning. I happen to like it. Like, I like the way it sounds. I like writing in it. Part of the reason I chose it was to kind of keep a sense of immediacy through the book, even though it jumps around in time. And if you haven't read it yet, I won't spoil anything, but there is an element of the plot, which to me is there from the beginning, but some people perceive as a twist fairly late in the book or as a surprise. And the present tense also really allowed me to obscure it in a way where the characters' thoughts are sort of more superficial than they might have been in the past tense. And I mean, it's such a basic choice. I feel like when you start writing anything, right, you have to make this decision of first person, third person, past tense, present tense, and it's such a fundamental decision and can sort of, it changes the entire form of what you're writing. But this, for whatever reason, I knew from the beginning would be present tense. And I think some of it, too, is, as I was saying earlier, just trying to mimic the tone of a ballet. I liked the sort of slightly odd flatness of it. But but I think the pitfall of present tense is that you are more inclined to get too detailed about. You can be like, he puts the pencil on the table but turns it slightly to the left, whereas in past tense it would never sort of occur to you to do that, which sounds like strange, but I think it's true. You get really sort of sucked into this. So I was trying to be mindful of that, and indeed in edits I did a lot of sort of cutting of unnecessary little bits and pieces. So I don't know how good an answer that is. I just liked it. And it's hard to sort of switch out of it. Like while I was writing, I would have to read present tense, because if I read past tense novels, I would find myself switching without realizing I'd done it. I'd write 3 pages in past tense and sort of be like, oh, great. Just change it.
Yeah, I know. Thank you so much.